We've just been talking about sensation, that is, how our sense organs collect information from the environment and send it on up to our brain, and our brain then presumably has to interpret it in some way. It doesn't quite answer the question, though, how we see in wholes, how we know a chair is a chair, a tree is a tree. All of these things are really asking the question, how do we perceive? We do want to know, however, whether we're born with this ability to perceive, or do we have to learn it over time? And the question is, how important is experience in shaping our perceptual interpretation? Immanuel Kant, a philosopher, maintained that knowledge comes from our inborn ways of organizing sensory experiences. In other words, he was stating that we have an inborn ability to organize the world. A bit earlier, John Locke argued that we learn to perceive the world through experience. So if we don't have certain experiences, then our perceptions may not be quite as good. The truth probably lies somewhere right in between. In the early 1900s, a group of psychologists in Berlin and other places in Germany decided to systematically explore how we organize the world. And these are known universally as the Gestalt principles of perceptual organization. They asked the question, how do we meaningfully form perceptions from sensory information? The answer they came up with is that we organize it. And so these are really principles of perceptual organization. The psychologists in the early 1900s showed that a figure formed a whole, and that it appears different from its surroundings, which they called ground. And so the basic principle starts out with the idea of figure and ground. Figure and ground means that you organize the visual field into objects, which they call figures, that stand out from their surroundings, which they called ground. Look at this figure and ground. Do you see arrows going in opposite directions? Or do you see men descending stairs? You're actually switching figure and ground when you go from men descending stairs to arrows going in opposite direction. This very famous figure and ground puzzle, you alternate between two faces looking at each other in profile and a vase. And of course, you can't see them both at the same time, which is the Gestalt psychologist's point. You pick out something and you see it as figure, and the rest becomes ground. In real life, we often have many figures on the background or ground, and we have to organize all of these figures. Accordingly, the Gestalt psychologists came up with what they called principles of grouping. After distinguishing the figure from the ground, our perception needs to organize all the figures that we see into a meaningful form to use grouping rules. The first principle that they talked about was proximity. If two things are closer together, they tend to be grouped. Think of two people waiting to be seated at a restaurant. They're standing one behind the other. The hostess comes up and says, "Two for lunch?" And the answer is no. Each one was individually waiting, but since they were standing in close proximity, that was a reasonable guess on the part of the hostess. So that's the idea of proximity. Things that are close together are sort of perceived as being together. Likewise, the principle of similarity. Notice that we tend to see these figures as three columns because of the triangles and the circles going up and down. We don't see these as rows. Going back to the restaurant example, if two people are standing together, particularly if one is a male and a female, and they're pretty close in age, then the hostess probably has even better reason for suggesting two for lunch. Again, she may be wrong. The third principle is continuity. That is, we like to think of things as continuing. This curvy line could be, in fact, just a series of figures that happen to bump up against the horizontal line. However, we prefer to think of it as a continuing flow. And that is the secret of neon signs. We tend to think of neon signs as going in a direction, even though they're just going on and off. The fourth principle is connectedness. things that are somehow attached to one another are seen as groups. This is not 6 dots with some lines. This is 3 pairs of dots. A fifth principle, called closure, is not one you've heard about, not in connection with perception perhaps, but in connection with emotional events. We're going to close this presentation with a fifth principle of organization from Gestalt psychology, namely closure. Closure is the tendency to complete a figure that has missing elements. Gestalt therapy even borrowed the term from Gestalt psychology to represent an incomplete emotional situation. And that's probably where you've heard the term closure. Look at this figure. It's hard not to see it as a triangle. It's not really a triangle. It's just 3 elements that could be formed into a triangle if they were completed. But our mind wants to complete it. That's closure. You can also look at this wonderful drawing of what? A panda. Even though the lines aren't complete, the idea of a panda is complete in our minds, and so we finish off this wonderful little drawing. And that essentially are the 5 principles of Gestalt organization. Gestalt psychology, however, has done very little to understand an important part of our perceptual process, namely, how do we see in depth?